I'll write part 1 now. Full cinematic prose in chat, no document. Beginning with the hook. This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, institutions, locations, and events are entirely invented. Mustn't. She didn't cry when they handed her the termination letter. She didn't cry when the security guard, a heavy-set man named Doyle, who she'd brought leftover empanadas for 3 Christmases, refused to meet her eyes as he walked her toward the lobby. She didn't cry when her badge was cut from her lanyard with a small pair of scissors, clinical and deliberate, like removing a tag from a piece of merchandise being returned. The plastic rectangle hit the polished floor with a sound so small it shouldn't have meant anything. It meant everything. And then, as Doyle reached down to retrieve it and drop it into a manila envelope, something slipped from the breast pocket of her scrub jacket. A challenge coin, dull bronze, worn smooth on the edges from years of handling. It spun twice on the tile and came to rest face up. The eagle on its face stared at the fluorescent ceiling. Nobody in the lobby of Crestwood Regional Medical Center had ever seen one before. Nobody knew what it meant. But the woman walking toward the exit with a cardboard box and 10 years of her life stacked in her arms, she knew exactly what it meant. And right now, she couldn't afford to think about it. Chet, if this story has you hooked already, follow along with me all the way to the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way bad mornings always do, quietly. Nora Voss arrived at Crestwood Regional at 6:45, same as she had for the past 3 years. Same battered canvas tote bag over one shoulder, same travel mug with the broken lid that dripped on her sleeve if she tilted it wrong. She took the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator on the east wing had been making a grinding noise for 2 weeks, and she'd filed a maintenance report that, as far as she could tell, had been read by no one. She passed the nurse's station on the 4th floor, dropped off a chart she'd taken home to review the night before, not because she was supposed to, but because something in the medication notes hadn't sat right with her, and went about her shift. Nora was 31 years old. She'd been a registered nurse for 6 years, 3 of them at Crestwood. Before that, a stint at a county trauma center in a different part of the state, and before that, something she didn't put on her nursing resume at all. She was medium height, lean in the way people get from moving constantly rather than working out, with dark circles that had become permanent fixtures somewhere around year 2 of post-military civilian life. She wore her hair pulled back tight enough that it gave her a faint headache by noon every day, which she never mentioned to anyone because mentioning it felt like admitting weakness, which was a habit she couldn't seem to break even now. She was not, by her own estimation, particularly likable. She was direct in a way that made some people call her efficient and other people call her cold. She remembered details, patient histories, dosage timings, which family members had asked which questions, in a way that occasionally made the attending physicians uncomfortable because it meant she noticed when something didn't match. She had been told, more than once, to soften her delivery. She had tried. It hadn't taken. The medication discrepancy she'd flagged 3 days ago was small, on paper. A dosage adjustment for a post-surgical patient in room 412, an elderly man named Wendell Pruitt who had a heart condition that had not been fully noted in the pre-op summary, had been entered incorrectly into the system. The error was consistent across 2 consecutive shift entries, which meant it wasn't a typo. It meant someone had been administering the wrong dose without catching it, or had caught it and not corrected the record, which was worse. Nora had brought it to the floor supervisor, Gail Hutchins, who had looked at the chart with the expression of a woman solving a mildly inconvenient crossword clue and said she'd look into it. Gail had not looked into it. Nora had then brought it to Dr. Philip Adler, the attending on Pruitt's case, who had listened with his arms crossed and his jaw doing a slow tightening rhythm, and then told her that the dosage had been adjusted intentionally based on his clinical judgment and that her concern, while noted, was not necessary. "You're a nurse," he'd said, not unkindly, just factually, the way you'd tell someone they were standing in the wrong line. "The clinical decisions are mine to make." "I understand that," Nora had said. "I'm flagging a documentation inconsistency. If the adjustment was intentional, The chart should reflect that. Right now it doesn't. Adler had looked at her for a moment with something behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger, more like calculation. "I'll update the notes," he'd said. He hadn't updated the notes. Nora knew this because she checked. She knew this was probably the thing that had sealed her fate. Checking. Not the initial report, not the follow-up with Gail, but the quiet, methodical checking. The kind of behavior that told an institution you weren't going to let something go. That was the moment she'd shifted from being a problem into being a threat. 2 days later, Gail had called her into the small office near the supply corridor that was used for whatever conversations administration didn't want happening in visible spaces. Gail had been accompanied by a man Nora had seen twice before, Raymond Holt, Director of Operations, a title that seemed designed to cover as much territory as possible while specifying nothing. Raymond was thin and carefully dressed and had a quality of stillness that Nora associated with people who had learned very early that the less they moved, the more authority they seemed to hold. "We're restructuring the staffing allocation on the 4th floor," Raymond had said, due to budget realignment. Nora had looked at him, then at Gail, who was studying the surface of the desk. "Budget realignment," Nora repeated. "It's not a reflection of your performance." "You're firing me." Raymond had paused at the word, as though she'd used profanity in a library. "We're eliminating the position." "My position that has existed in this unit for 3 years. Staffing needs evolve." Nora had felt something in her chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was more like a kind of tired recognition, the specific exhaustion of being unsurprised. She had been in situations before where the machinery of an institution had decided she was inconvenient. She knew what that felt like. It felt exactly like this. "I filed a patient safety report," she said, 2 days ago. "That's unrelated. I'd like that in writing." Raymond's stillness had acquired a faint edge. "The paperwork will be processed through HR." "That's not what I asked for." What she got instead was Doyle, with his apologetic non-gaze and her badge in a manila envelope and a cardboard box that someone had helpfully pre-assembled, which told her this hadn't been a decision made this morning. They'd been ready. The box was the detail that confirmed it. Whoever had authorized this had thought through the logistics, which meant they'd had time, which meant the conversation with Raymond hadn't been a meeting, it had been a notification. She packed her own things because she was damned if she'd let anyone else touch them. Stethoscope. The small laminated quick reference card for pediatric drug dosages that she'd made herself and laminated at a pharmacy 2 years ago because the hospital's version was outdated and wrong. A photograph of a landscape she'd taped to the inside of her locker. Mountains, no people, somewhere she'd been once when things were different. A worn paperback she kept for slow nights that she'd never once opened at work. She was precise and methodical about it because precision was how she kept herself from doing anything she'd regret, and she had a long history of knowing the difference between the two. The challenge coin she'd almost missed. It had slipped from her breast pocket to the back corner of the locker shelf, and she'd had to reach past her folded spare scrubs to retrieve it. She tucked it into her jacket pocket without thinking. It was an old habit, keeping it close. She'd carried it so long she didn't consciously decide to carry it anymore. It was just something her hands knew to do. Doyle walked her to the lobby. He said, "I'm sorry, Nora," once, quietly, near the elevator. And she said, "I know," because she believed him, and because it didn't change anything. Her badge hit the floor. The coin spun. She walked out into the Millhaven morning. Millhaven, in early autumn, was one of those cities that looked better from a distance than it did up close. From the interstate overpass, you got skyline and river and the particular pale blue of a September sky that photographers came from other states to shoot. On the ground, it was cracked sidewalks and construction scaffolding and the smell of diesel from the freight routes that cut through the east side. Nora had moved here because rent was manageable and the hospital had offered her the position, and she'd had no particular reason to go anywhere else. She'd built no deep roots. She had an apartment 12 minutes from the hospital, a neighbor named Dale who left passive-aggressive notes about recycling bin placement, and a cat she'd adopted from a shelter 4 months ago named Mac, who had one eye and strong opinions about meal timing. She was thinking about Mac, actually, whether she'd bought enough food, whether she'd need to recalibrate everything now, how long her savings would last while she figured out her next move. when she turned north on Carver Street and came in sight of the Route 9 overpass. She heard it before she saw it. The sound was enormous and wrong, a cascading series of impacts, metal on concrete, and then a sound she recognized in some deep, non-civilian part of her brain as the particular resonance of a large vehicle losing structural integrity at speed. Then screaming, which started sharp and immediate and kept going, and the lower register of an engine still running attached to something that had stopped moving. Nora stopped walking. Then she set down her cardboard box on the sidewalk next to a bus stop bench. She set it down carefully, not urgently, the way you set something down when you know you're not coming back for it right away. Then she ran. The overpass intersection at Carver and Route 9 was a mess that hadn't finished becoming itself yet. A semi-truck had jackknifed across 2 lanes, its trailer folded at a 90-degree angle and pinning a compact sedan against the center divider. A second vehicle, a panel van, had rear-ended the sedan and was now wedged under the trailer's edge at an angle that had compromised the van's roof. Further back, a third and fourth car had piled into the van and each other respectively, and one of them was burning. Not fully, not yet, but a steady dark smoke was rising from under the hood, and the smell of it was reaching the street level below. People were out of their cars in the ways people get out of cars after accidents, some standing still in shock, some moving in random directions. 2 people arguing near the front of the traffic backup, with the wild energy of people who haven't yet processed that the argument is not the most important thing happening. A woman was sitting on the asphalt beside an open car door with her hands in her lap, staring at something Nora couldn't see. A man in a delivery jacket was filming with his phone. There were maybe 15 people visible. Nora's brain went through them in approximately 4 seconds. "Hey!" She grabbed the man with the phone by the sleeve, not hard, just enough to turn him. "Stop filming. Call 911. Tell them multi-vehicle accident, Route 9 overpass at Carver, minimum 4 vehicles, at least 1 fire, multiple injuries, request fire, and EMS." The man blinked. "I was going to..." "Do it right now. Repeat what I just said." He repeated it, more or less correctly, and she moved on. The woman sitting on the asphalt was a priority. Her position, the vacant quality of her gaze, the way her right arm was held at a slightly wrong angle. Nora crouched in front of her. "What's your name?" The woman focused slowly. "Patrice?" "Patrice. I'm Nora. I'm a nurse. Are you having trouble breathing?" "I don't." Patrice blinked. "My arm." "I can see that. Don't move it. Is there anyone else in your car?" "No. I was alone." "Okay. Stay here. Don't stand up yet." Nora made eye contact with a teenage boy who was standing nearby doing nothing with the focused paralysis of someone who desperately wanted to help and had no framework for it. "You, come here." He came. "Sit with her. If she starts having trouble breathing or she loses consciousness, yell for me, loud. Can you do that?" "Yeah," he said, and the yes of it straightened him up a little. She moved toward the van. The driver was conscious and trying to open his door, which wasn't going to work because the door frame had deformed on impact. She rapped on the window. "Can you hear me?" Yeah, I can hear you." His voice was high and strained. "I can't get the door open." "I see that. Are you bleeding anywhere?" She was already scanning what she could through the glass. I think my head." There was blood on the side of his face, scalp laceration, looked superficial from what she could tell, but scalp wounds bled dramatically, and she couldn't fully assess him through the window. "What's your name?" "Dwight." "Dwight, I need you to stay still. Don't try to force the door. EMS is coming. They'll get you out properly. Does your neck hurt? Any tingling in your hands or feet?" Pause. No, I don't think so." "Keep your head still anyway. Don't look around. Stay looking forward." She moved on because she had to. The burning car was her next priority, or rather, the burning car was everyone's ambient panic, and she needed to assess whether it was an immediate threat or a delayed one. She got close enough to see that the fire was still in the engine compartment, not the fuel line. The fuel line would change things considerably, and that the driver appeared to be gone, door open, standing about 15 feet away looking dazed but vertical. She got to him in 3 strides. Are you burned? The man, 50s, large, wearing a grease-stained work shirt, held up his hands instinctively and looked at them. I don't think so. Did you hit your head? I don't know. She put her hands on either side of his face briefly, not gently but not roughly, tilting his head to check his pupils in the available light. Slightly unequal. Maybe. The light was bad. Sit down, right here on the curb. Don't walk anywhere. Don't lie down. Sit. She got him down. Someone's coming, okay? I'll be back. The woman from the sedan was unconscious. Nora found her when she reached the center divider. Still in the car, still belted, head lolled forward, the airbag deployed and now deflated. The sedan's roof was intact. The driver's side door was pressed against the divider barrier, but the passenger side might open. Nora went around, tried it. It opened 6 inches and caught on something from the truck's trailer. She jammed her knee against it and got another 4 inches, got her head and shoulder inside. Hey, can you hear me? She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck. Pulse, strong enough, irregular in a way she didn't like. The woman's color was off, pale going toward gray. What happened to you? Nora said quietly, not really asking the woman, asking the situation. She looked at the woman's torso. The steering column had shifted, not drastically, but enough. She needed this car stabilized, and she needed a cervical collar she didn't have, and she needed another 2 people with trained hands, and she had none of those things. What she had was a bystander in a hardware store apron standing 8 feet away with his mouth open. Come here, she said. Come here right now. What's your name? Terry. Terry, I need you to get on this side of the car and put your hands here. She guided his hands to the woman's headrest, positioning them around the sides without touching the neck. Don't push, don't pull, just hold her exactly like that. If she starts moving, if her head moves on its own, you tell me immediately, okay? Okay, yeah. You're doing the most important job here right now. Don't move your hands. She got her fingers back on the woman's pulse and counted. The irregularity was more pronounced. She needed a defibrillator, and she was not going to get one before EMS arrived, and the only thing she could do right now was track the rhythm and be ready. Behind her, she heard someone shouting, a man's voice, cracking at the edges in a way that cut through the ambient noise. My son's in there. He's in the van. The back of the van. I can't get to him. She turned. A man was at the rear of the panel van trying to pull open the back doors, which had partially fused on impact. He was pulling hard enough that it wasn't going to help him. His hands were bleeding where the bent metal had cut them, and he either hadn't noticed or didn't care. Stop, Nora said loudly and clearly, crossing to him in 8 strides. Stop pulling. My son is... I heard you. Stop pulling. You're going to make it worse. She physically moved his hands off the door handles. He let her, in the way people let you when you speak to them, in a particular register, a register she'd learned in conditions where it was the only thing that kept situations from unraveling. How old? 14. His name is Marcus. He was in the back. There was a... How long ago did the crash happen? I don't know. 5 minutes? I don't know. She looked at the doors. The frame had bent inward at the top right corner, locking the mechanism. She needed leverage. She turned and scanned the road and found, 15 feet away, a lug wrench that had come from somewhere in the debris. She got it. She worked the flat end into the gap between the doors at the top corner where the frame had bent, and she put her weight into it, hard and deliberate. The door popped. The inside of the van was smoke-filled and darker than it should have been. She pulled the door the rest of the way open, and the smoke came out at her. The boy was in the back corner, crumpled against the wheel well. 14, small for it, dark jacket, a backpack still on one shoulder. She moved to him in the crouch walk she'd learned in conditions that had nothing to do with nursing school and pressed 2 fingers to his throat. Pulse. She breathed. Marcus. She shook him, not gently. Marcus, can you hear me? He didn't respond. His lips were going blue. His airway, she said to herself, tilting his head carefully, checking his mouth. Nothing obstructing, airway clear, but he wasn't breathing, not on his own, and the smoke was still coming from somewhere in the front of the van, and she could now see that the van's front compartment had a fire starting, real this time, not engine heat, actual flame low on the passenger footwell. She grabbed Marcus under his arms, the backpack twisting and catching, and she dragged him toward the open doors, out of the van, down onto the road surface, clear of the doors. His father was there immediately. Don't touch him yet," she said. "Stay back." She tipped Marcus's head back, lifted his chin, watched his chest. Nothing. She gave 2 rescue breaths, watched his chest rise. Then she began compressions, counting in her head because counting out loud took breath she might need, and because she'd done this enough times that counting out loud was actually less accurate, not more. She was on the second cycle when Marcus's chest shuddered and he coughed, a deep convulsive cough that went on, and he turned his head to the side and his eyelids flickered. She sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. She only noticed because she looked at them. She made them stop. Marcus, his father had gotten past her, was on his knees beside him, voice coming apart. "Marcus, don't move him," Nora said. "He's breathing. Don't move his neck. Stay with him." She stood up. Behind her, the van's front compartment fire had found something it liked. There was a sound like a soft exhale, and then the fire tripled in the time it took her to turn around. The heat hit her face. She stepped backward, staying between it and Marcus and his father by instinct, putting her body in the way because that was also an old habit, one that had been built somewhere else entirely. In the distance, she could hear sirens. Multiple units. They were still a ways out, but coming. She looked at the scene around her. At Terry, still at the sedan window with his hands exactly where she'd put them. At the teenager sitting with Patrice. At Dwight's face through the van window. At the man with the possible head injury sitting on the curb where she'd put him. At Marcus, coughing and conscious, and his father's hands hovering over him, terrified to touch and terrified not to. Everything was where she'd put it. Everyone was doing what she'd asked. She turned her face away from the fire because her eyes were stinging and she didn't want to mistake that for anything else. Her scrubs. She was still in her scrubs, she realized, still in the clothes she'd been wearing when they walked her out of Crestwood Regional like a security risk, were covered in road grime and something dark at the knee that was probably blood. Her hands were filthy. There was a cut across her right palm that she genuinely could not remember getting. She pressed it against her hip and went back to work. The sirens got louder. There were more of them than she expected, different frequencies layered over each other. Ground units, she could tell those by now. But also something else, something above and getting louder and coming from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She looked up. 2 helicopters. Not news helicopters. Wrong shape, wrong paint, wrong sound. Military profile, but not combat aircraft. Something in between. Large rotors, medical markings in a configuration she recognized from a particular period of her life that she'd been trying very hard to keep in a closed compartment. They were coming down. There was a stretch of overpass shoulder wide enough, barely, and whoever was flying the lead aircraft was very good, because they put it down on the first pass without hesitation. The second aircraft circled. The side door opened before the rotors fully stopped. The team that came out was moving with an efficiency she recognized immediately and viscerally, the way you recognize a language you grew up speaking even when you haven't heard it in years. Gear, formation, communication. 2 on the sedan, 1 going straight for the burning van with equipment, the team leader scanning the scene with the particular quality of focus that wasn't looking at the disaster. It was reading it, the same way she'd been reading it, looking for the system underneath the chaos. His eyes found the sedan first, then Terry, with his hands positioned exactly right, then the teenager with Patrice, then Dwight at the van window, then Marcus on the ground with his father kneeling beside him. Then they found her. The team leader was maybe 45, tall, a face that had spent significant time outdoors, wearing the kind of calm that isn't the absence of intensity, but its exact opposite. He walked toward her with the measured stride of someone who had long ago stopped moving quickly, except when it was necessary. "Who organized this scene?" he asked. His voice was even and unhurried, but there was weight under it. Nora looked at him. She was aware of how she looked, filthy, blood on her scrubs, cut on her hand, hair half escaped from its pullback. She was aware that she was standing in the middle of a disaster scene on a day when she'd been fired, carrying nothing but the habit of herself. "I did," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then his gaze moved to her pocket, the breast pocket of her scrub jacket, where the challenge coin was visible by about a quarter inch, just the edge of it, bronze-worn smooth. Something shifted in his expression, something that wasn't quite recognition and then very suddenly was. "What's your name?" he said. She told him. He went very still. And then, behind her, one of his team members called out from the sedan. The woman's heart rhythm had changed. They needed to move now. And the team leader turned away from Nora with the specific reluctance of a man who'd found something significant at exactly the wrong time. And she turned too, because there was still work to do, and for the next 4 minutes, that was all there was. But when the sedan door was finally opened and the woman inside was on a board and the airway was secured, the team leader came back to where Nora was standing, and he looked at her in a way that nobody from Crestwood Regional had looked at her in a very long time. Not like a liability, not like an inconvenience, not like a nurse who didn't know her place. He looked at her like someone who knew exactly who she was. And he looked deeply, specifically troubled by the fact that she was standing here on a highway overpass in dirty scrubs on what was clearly not a good day, instead of wherever she was supposed to be. "We need to talk," he said. And somewhere in the middle distance, a stretcher carrying Marcus to the second aircraft passed between them. And the boy's eyes were open, and his color was coming back, and his father was running alongside with his bloody hands outstretched, and the medical team not stopping him because sometimes the right call is to know what matters. Nora watched until they were past. Then she looked back at the team leader. "Yeah," she said, "I think we probably do." His name was Colonel Dane Whitfield, and he said it the way military men say their names. Rank first, last name second, first name an afterthought that existed primarily on paperwork. He said it while walking, because standing still wasn't something his body defaulted to easily, and Nora had to keep pace with him through the organized movement of his team across the overpass, stepping around equipment cases and avoiding the attention of the 2 news vans that had arrived at the police perimeter below and were already pointing cameras upward. "You did battlefield triage on a civilian highway," Whitfield said. It wasn't a question. "I did what the situation needed. Cervical precautions, airway management, scene organization. You triaged 15 people in approximately 8 minutes before my team touched the ground." He stopped walking and turned to look at her directly. "Where did you train?" Nora looked at him steadily. "Nursing school. And some other places." Whitfield's jaw moved slightly. He looked at the coin again. It was fully visible now. She'd stopped tucking it away. There was no point. And something moved through his face that she couldn't entirely read. Recognition, definitely, but also something more complicated, something that looked like he was rearranging a set of facts he'd already organized and finding they didn't fit the arrangement anymore. "The 209th?" he said quietly. She didn't answer. "You were with the 209th Medical Battalion, forward surgical, 2 deployments, Kandahar, and then the FOB rotation in 17. He paused. "You trained the advanced trauma cohort before you separated." "You've done your homework," Nora said. "I didn't have to. I know who you are." He held her gaze. 3 people in my unit are alive right now because of protocols you wrote. Not protocols you contributed to. Protocols you wrote, with your name on them, and then the Army bureaucracy spent 2 years renaming and redistributing until your name wasn't on them anymore. He said it flatly, not with outrage, just as a statement of documented fact. "So when I land my aircraft on a highway overpass and find a crime scene organized with FOB-level efficiency, and then I find you standing in the middle of it in civilian scrubs, I'm going to ask you again, what are you doing here?" Nora looked down at herself. The scrubs were a disaster. The blood on her knee had dried to rust. There was ash on her left forearm that she'd gotten from the van and hadn't bothered to wipe off. She looked, objectively, like someone who had been in the disaster, rather than someone who had managed it. "I had a bad morning," she said. Whitfield waited. She exhaled through her nose. "I was at Crestwood Regional. I got fired about—" She checked the bare patch on her wrist where she didn't wear a watch anymore, a habit from the field that she'd never corrected. "About 90 minutes ago, I was walking home." Something shifted in Whitfield's expression. Not pity. She would have closed the conversation instantly for pity. More like the particular attention of a person who had just received a piece of information that made several other pieces of information reconfigure. Crestwood Regional, he repeated. Budget realignment, Nora said, with the specific flatness of a person saying the official story, because the official story was shorter than the real one. Whitfield looked at her for another moment. Then one of his team members called his name from near the first helicopter. The woman from the sedan was stabilized and ready for transport. They needed a decision on destination. He turned, gave the instruction, turned back. The interruption had given both of them a beat, and Nora used it to press her cut palm against her hip again, which was becoming a rhythmic habit now as the adrenaline metabolized and the pain started waking up. That needs to be looked at, Whitfield said, nodding at her hand. It's fine. It's still bleeding. It's fine, she said again, because it was, relatively, and because accepting medical attention felt like ceding something she wasn't ready to cede. Whitfield let it go in the way men who have dealt with stubborn people for a long time let things go. Not conceding, just filing it for later. We're taking the critical cases to Harmon Valley Medical, the regional trauma center. He looked at her. Come with us. I'm not a patient. I didn't say you were, I said come with us. He paused. We're not done talking. Nora looked at the overpass, at the police units that had arrived and were managing the perimeter, at the fire department crew finishing with the van, at the last of the civilians being walked toward ambulances. The scene was contained. Her work here was complete. Her cardboard box was still on the bus stop bench on Carver Street, and she had a cat at home with one eye and strong opinions about being fed on time. She got in the helicopter. Harmon Valley Medical Center's trauma bay was louder than Crestwood's had ever been, which was either a reflection of volume or culture or both. Nora sat on a plastic chair in the corridor outside the bay, while Whitfield's team worked alongside the hospital staff on the transfer of care. She had her cut hand wrapped in gauze from a kit one of the medics had handed her without commentary, which she appreciated. The medic, young, female, efficient in the way Nora recognized as trained rather than natural, had also handed her a bottle of water and a foil-wrapped protein bar that tasted like chocolate and chalk, and which Nora ate entirely because she'd been on shift since 6:45 and hadn't eaten since 5. The corridor had the quality of somewhere between shifts. Not quiet, but the movement was purposeful rather than urgent, people going from one place to another with information rather than with crises. She watched it with the attention she brought to all medical environments, the kind of watching that cataloged and assessed without trying to. A habit so ingrained she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. What she noticed, the nursing staff moved efficiently, but there was friction at the medication station. Someone had reorganized the pull drawers, and the new arrangement was slower, which was a decision that had been made by someone who managed supply chains rather than someone who pulled medications under pressure. She noticed a patient call light that had been on for at least 4 minutes by the time she'd counted. She noticed a physician typing with his back to the hall who had the particular posture of a man doing documentation 2 hours after he should have handed off. She noticed these things and filed them in the part of her brain that was always running and tried to focus on the water bottle. Whitfield came out of the trauma bay 20 minutes later. He pulled up a chair across from her without asking if the chair was available, sat in it, and put his elbows on his knees in a posture that was less formal than anything she'd seen from him on the overpass. He looked tired. Not dangerously tired, but the kind of tired that accumulated. "The woman from the sedan?" he said. "Cardiac event. Secondary to the impact, or the impact triggered something that was already developing. I couldn't tell from the outside." "They're saying your assessment, the positioning, keeping her still, the precautions, probably prevented a fatal arrhythmia." He looked at her steadily. "They used the word probably. I'll take it. How's the boy?" "Marcus." Whitfield said the name like it had weight, which it did. "Hypoxic episode from smoke inhalation. He's going to be fine. They want to keep him overnight." A pause. "His father won't leave the chair next to his bed." "Good," Nora said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I made some calls while we were in transit." She'd known he would. "Okay. I have a colleague at Crestwood, not medical staff, Administrative liaison, she does regulatory compliance work for a contractor we deal with. I asked her to pull what she could on the situation. Nora went very still. Not in an unfriendly way. In the way of someone calculating whether to be annoyed or to let it continue. She didn't pull patient records, Whitfield said. She pulled publicly available complaint filings and cross-referenced termination timing. He met her eyes. You filed a patient safety report 3 days ago. You were terminated 48 hours later. That's what I said. The report flagged a medication documentation error in a post-surgical cardiac patient. He paused. That patient, Wendell Pruitt, was readmitted to Crestwood this morning, 4 hours after you were walked out. Nora set the water bottle down. Readmitted for what? She asked, and her voice came out more level than she felt, which was a skill she'd been practicing for most of her adult life. Cardiac irregularity. They're calling it an unrelated incident. Whitfield watched her face. My colleague noted that the timing creates what she called a regulatory interest in the initial documentation error. The corridor felt louder suddenly, or maybe she'd just stopped filtering it. An orderly with a squeaky wheel on his cart went past. The call light she'd been watching was still on. He's okay? She said. Pruitt? Stable, from what she could tell. Nora exhaled. She looked at the ceiling, which was acoustic tile, generic, the kind of ceiling she'd looked at in 100 medical facilities in 2 different careers, and she thought about Wendell Pruitt, who she had spent 40 minutes with over 3 visits to room 412, who had a daughter in Tucson who'd called twice while Nora was doing his assessment, and whose voicemail greeting was a recording of a child's voice saying, "You reached Grandpa's phone," which was the kind of detail you weren't supposed to track but did. I need to know who else saw the original chart, she said. That's not something I can pull. I know. She looked back at Whitfield, but it's what I need to know. He nodded slowly. He wasn't dismissing it. He was acknowledging that they were now in a different conversation than the one they'd started on the overpass, and he was deciding how he felt about that. There's something else, he said. She waited. The medication irregularity you flagged. The contractor my colleague works for does compliance auditing for 3 hospital systems in this region. Crestwood is one of them. He paused. The audit flagged Crestwood's pharmacy procurement records 14 months ago. There were discrepancies in billing versus dispensing volume that suggested either waste at a scale that didn't match their reported protocols or diversion. Diversion, Nora said. Someone skimming medications. The audit was submitted. It was reviewed. He looked at her steadily. It was closed without action. The implications of that landed in order, one after another. Nora tracked them with the same methodical quality she'd used to triage the overpass. Not panicking, just understanding what she was looking at. Someone had filed an audit. Someone had reviewed it. Someone had decided it wasn't worth pursuing. And the people in the building who were skimming medications, or tolerating it, or actively covering it, had continued doing so and had continued being protected until a floor nurse had filed a patient safety report about a medication documentation error that, if properly investigated, would have led directly back to the same discrepancy. And then that floor nurse had been fired. Dr. Adler, she said. Whitfield tilted his head slightly. The attending, the one I went to after Gail didn't act on my report. His reaction wasn't right. I thought it was ego, that's what it looked like, she paused. But that's not what it was. No, Whitfield said. Probably not. The water bottle was empty. She didn't remember finishing it. She set it on the chair beside her and pressed her wrapped hand against her leg and felt the dull pull of it, and thought about how strange it was to be sitting in a hospital corridor having this conversation on the same day she'd been escorted out of a different one. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not accusatorially, genuinely. Whitfield considered the question with more seriousness than most people gave it. Because you wrote the protocols, he said finally, and because what I saw on that overpass, a woman who shouldn't have been there doing exactly the thing she was trained to do on the worst possible day, that's not a coincidence I'm comfortable ignoring. It was an honest answer. She appreciated honest answers, even when they complicated things. I need access to Pruitt's chart, she said. The original version, before any amendments. You don't have privileges here. I know. And you no longer have privileges at Crestwood. I know that too. Whitfield looked at her. There are ways to formally request medical records as part of a patient safety complaint to the state board. If your original report was filed, it was filed. I have the confirmation number. She'd taken a photograph of the submission confirmation on her phone before she'd been walked out, because of course she had, because she'd known this was coming. The question is whether the board acts on it before someone amends Pruitt's chart. That's a real question, Whitfield said. Yes, Nora said. It is. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the trauma bay, something was changing, a shift in the ambient sound, a controlled increase in movement, voices, the specific rapid quality of medical personnel redirecting. Whitfield stood. Nora stood, because he did, the instinct automatic. One of Whitfield's team members, the efficient young medic from the helicopter, appeared at the trauma bay door and looked at him. Colonel, we've got a secondary issue. What? The first responders who handled scene management before we arrived. Some of them are talking to reporters. She glanced at Nora. Specifically about the woman who organized the scene before anyone in a uniform got there. Nora felt something cold move through her chest. How many reporters? Whitfield asked. Right now, 3 outlets, but there's footage from bystander phones, and at least 2 of the people she helped are in this building, and at least one of them is talking. The cold thing in Nora's chest did not become panic. It became instead a very specific awareness that the shape of her day had just changed in a way she hadn't calculated for. She had been thinking about patient charts and board complaints, and Wendell Pruitt's cardiac rhythm. She had not been thinking about footage. I need to make a call, Nora said. Agreed, Whitfield said. But first, he stopped. His medic had said something quietly in his ear, and his expression had shifted in the way trained people's expressions shifted when something went from complicated to urgent. He turned to Nora with the look of a man setting down one problem to pick up a larger one. There's a press briefing being organized. The fire department incident commander wants to address the scene management. They're going to ask about civilian involvement. They can say a bystander assisted, a bystander with battlefield triage skills. He paused. Who was filmed, who is currently in this building. The call light in the corridor was still on. Nora noticed it distantly, the way you notice irrelevant things when your brain is running too fast on the primary problem. Tell me what you need, she said. Right now? I need you to make a decision about whether you want to be in front of this or behind it, because in about 20 minutes, it's going to make that decision for you. She thought of Crestwood, of Raymond Holt and his careful stillness, of her badge on the floor and the pre-assembled cardboard box, of Wendell Pruitt in room 412, readmitted this morning for a cardiac irregularity that nobody at Crestwood Regional wanted examined too closely. She thought of Dr. Adler's face when she'd said the words documentation inconsistency. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just that slow tightening in his jaw, the particular quality of a man who had too much to lose and had just identified the shape of the thing that could cost it. I'll talk to them, she said. Whitfield nodded. He didn't look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who had made a bet and had just learned the odds were better than he'd been told. One condition, Nora said. He waited. Pruitt's records. Whatever access I can get through formal channels, I want that process started before the briefing. I can have my compliance contact file a preservation request to the state board within the hour. That stops any amendments. Then let's go. They were moving toward the corridor that led to the hospital's main entrance, toward the reporters, toward the cameras, toward the thing she hadn't planned for and couldn't avoid. When Whitfield's phone rang, he glanced at it, and something in the quality of his attention changed completely. He stopped walking. I need to take this, he said. Nora stopped too. He stepped 3 feet to the side and answered, and she wasn't trying to listen, but the corridor wasn't built for privacy, and she caught enough. A name she didn't recognize, something about a federal contract, and then, clearly and distinctly, the words Crestwood Regional, coming from Whitfield's side of the call in a tone that she'd never heard from him before, something that sat between controlled alarm and sharp, focused anger. He finished the call in under 90 seconds. He turned back to her. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do yet. The audit that was closed 14 months ago, he said. The procurement discrepancy. Yes. It wasn't closed because someone decided it wasn't worth pursuing. He paused, and she could see him choosing the words with more care than he'd used for anything yet. It was closed because someone at the contracting agency received a call from someone at Crestwood's administrative board and agreed to table it. Informally. Nora felt the cold thing expand. That's not a regulatory decision, she said. That's interference. That's a federal offense, Whitfield said quietly, if it can be documented. The corridor hummed around them. The call light was finally off. Someone had answered it. The physician with the bad posture was gone from his station. The world was doing its ordinary things, and underneath it, something had just shifted in a way that was going to be very difficult to contain. The person who called my compliance contact just now, Whitfield said. It wasn't her calling about Pruitt. Then why? Because she'd already been contacted by someone else, earlier today, before we landed on that overpass. He held her gaze. Someone from Crestwood's administration made calls this morning after your termination. Not to HR, not to their legal department. He stopped. To a member of the contracting agency's oversight board. Nora stood completely still. They were trying to preempt any complaint you might file, Whitfield said. They wanted to make sure that if you went to the state board, the groundwork was there to make you look like a disgruntled employee, discredit whatever you reported. They made those calls this morning, within 2 hours of walking you out. She thought about the pre-assembled box again, the small scissors cutting her lanyard, the deliberateness of it all, the preparation, the machinery that had been running before she'd even arrived for her shift. They hadn't fired her because she was inconvenient. They'd fired her because they already knew what she'd found, and they'd had a plan, prepared and ready for what to do next. Nora. It was the first time Whitfield had used her first name. It sounded different than she'd expected, less formal, which meant he'd made a decision about what this was. Before we go to that briefing, I need you to understand something. The calls they made this morning, my contact documented them, time-stamped. The person they reached out to panicked when she realized what she'd agreed to facilitate, and she called the compliance line. Nora absorbed that. So there's a record, she said. There's a record, he confirmed. She looked at the floor for a moment, linoleum, institutional gray, scuffed in the patterns of high traffic zones. She looked up. They fired me this morning, she said. Yes. And by this afternoon, they're going to be the ones trying to explain themselves. Whitfield's expression did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. The particular look of a man who had been in enough situations to recognize when momentum shifted and to respect it when it did. Looks that way, he said. Nora picked up the thread of where they'd been going, toward the entrance, toward the reporters, toward whatever came next in a day that had started with her badge on a floor and a coin spinning on tile and a security guard who couldn't meet her eyes. She was 3 steps down the corridor when a door opened behind them. Not Whitfield's team, not hospital staff. 2 men in suits who had the specific quality of people who did not work in hospitals and had not come here for medical reasons. They were looking at Whitfield with the particular attention of people who already knew who he was. And then one of them looked at Nora, and the recognition on his face was immediate and deliberate. Ms. Voss? He said. She stopped. My name is Special Agent Rourke, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He held his badge briefly, long enough to be genuine, short enough to be efficient. We've been looking for you since approximately 10 this morning. The corridor felt suddenly very small. We have some questions, Rourke said, about Crestwood Regional Medical Center. Nora looked at the badge, then at Rourke, then at the second agent who hadn't introduced himself and was doing the thing where you position yourself at an angle that isn't blocking, but technically is. Since 10 this morning, she said. That's correct. You've been looking for me for, she glanced at a clock on the wall, about 4.5 hours. We went to Crestwood Regional first, then your home address, your neighbor, Dale. Said he hadn't seen you leave this morning. Rourke paused. We were informed of your involvement at the Route 9 incident by the fire department incident commander approximately 40 minutes ago. Nora thought about Dale and his recycling bin notes, and the fact that she apparently owed him an apology for assuming the worst about him because he hadn't told a federal agent she'd left that morning, which was either principle or genuine ignorance, and either way was more than she'd expected. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "The kind better discussed somewhere private." Rourke's tone was professionally neutral, not threatening, not warm, just the specific register of someone who had done this enough times to know that affect was a tool. "We have a room." Whitfield stepped forward, not aggressively, just into the conversation. "I'm Colonel Dane Whitfield, 4th Medical Brigade. Miss Voss assisted at a mass casualty incident under my operational observation this afternoon. I have an interest in her availability." Rourke looked at Whitfield the way people look at something that complicates their plan but doesn't stop it. "Noted, Colonel. This shouldn't take long." Whitfield looked at Nora. The look said, "Your call. She made it. Let's go." The room they had was a conference space off the hospital's administrative wing, the kind used for interdepartmental meetings, with a folding table and chairs that didn't match, and a whiteboard someone had half erased. The second agent, who eventually identified himself as Agent Carver, compact, watchful, the kind of person who generated no particular impression, and that was probably deliberate, set a recorder on the table without making a production of it. "We're conducting a federal investigation into procurement irregularities at Crestwood Regional Medical Center," Rourke said. "The investigation was opened 6 weeks ago. Your patient safety report, filed 3 days ago, created a procedural intersection with our case." "Procedural intersection," Nora repeated. "Your report flagged a medication documentation error in a post-surgical cardiac patient. The documentation pattern is consistent with what we've been tracking in Crestwood's pharmacy procurement records." She sat back in her chair. The gauze on her hand had done its job, and the bleeding had stopped, but the hand was stiff now, the way cuts got when the adrenaline finished and the surrounding tissue remembered it was offended. She rested it on the table and looked at Rourke. "You've been investigating for 6 weeks," she said, "and nobody contacted me." "We didn't know you existed 6 weeks ago. The report put you in the picture." He paused. "Your termination put you further in it." "Because it's retaliation. Because the timing is, legally speaking, extremely interesting." Rourke pulled a folder from the bag Carver had carried in and opened it on the table. "Dr. Philip Adler. What can you tell me about him?" The shift from information to question was practiced and deliberate. Nora didn't perform reluctance because she had none. "Attending physician, surgical ward, 4th floor, 3 years at Crestwood, maybe 4. He came from a system in the southern part of the state. I don't remember which one." She thought. "He makes decisions fast. Not always right, but fast. The staff works around him rather than with him, which means he doesn't get a lot of pushback from the floor. His documentation is thorough, but retrospective. He writes notes after the fact rather than concurrent with care." Rourke was writing. "Retrospective documentation can indicate he's busy. It can also indicate he's covering his timeline." She kept her voice level. "With Pruitt, the documentation didn't match the administration record. That's not a busy doctor writing late notes. That's a record that was altered." "Altered how?" "The dosage entry for the evening of the 14th was in a different format than his other entries. Minor thing, notation style, a unit abbreviation he doesn't normally use. I noticed because I'd read his notes enough times to know what his patterns looked like." She paused. "Someone else wrote that entry and formatted it to look like his." Rourke stopped writing. He looked at her. "You believe someone else accessed Adler's credentials and made that entry?" "I believe the entry doesn't look like him. Whether he gave someone access or someone took it, I don't know." Carver spoke for the first time. "Were you aware that Adler has a financial relationship with Holloway Medical Supply?" The name meant nothing to her. She said so. "They're a regional pharmaceutical distributor. They supply approximately 30% of Crestwood's medication inventory." Carver's voice was flat and informational. "Adler holds a consulting contract with Holloway, has for 2 years. That contract is not disclosed in his hospital credentialing file." Nora was quiet for a moment. "He's steering prescription volume," she said. "We believe he's doing more than that." Carver glanced at Rourke. We believe Adler has been authorizing medication orders at dosages that differ from what gets dispensed and documented, with the difference going somewhere other than the patient. The full shape of it assembled in her mind cleanly and completely, the way the triage picture had assembled on the overpass. Not immediately, but fast, with each piece locking the next into place. The irregularity in Pruitt's chart wasn't a documentation error. It was evidence of a system. Someone had adjusted the record to cover a dosage discrepancy that would have pointed directly at what was being diverted and how. Pruitt was a problem, she said. His condition made the dosage deviation medically visible. If he'd had a cardiac event, it would have been attributed to his underlying condition, Rourke said. Yes, that's our read. He was readmitted this morning. We know. Something moved across Rourke's face. Not quite discomfort, more like a man acknowledging a fact he'd rather wasn't true. We've had Pruitt's chart flagged, which is why we need to know. He stopped, recalibrated. Who else on the nursing staff was aware of your report? She thought about it honestly. Gail Hutchins. She was the first person I went to. She didn't act on it, but she knew. She paused. Possibly someone in pharmacy, if they did any kind of internal cross-reference after I filed. I didn't speak to pharmacy directly. Hutchins reported to who? Raymond Holt, operations director. She looked at Rourke. He was in the room when they terminated me. He was the one who said budget realignment. Holt has been on our peripheral list. Rourke said it in a way that suggested peripheral was a temporary status. The calls made from Crestwood's administration this morning to the Contracting Oversight Board, those were made from Holt's office phone. She thought about his careful stillness, the way he'd received her question about putting the firing's unrelatedness to her report in writing, the micro-flicker of something that wasn't surprise. He knew, she said. Before the meeting, he'd already made calls. We believe the decision to terminate you was made within 2 hours of your safety report being filed 3 days ago. The termination was delayed until they could establish the budget narrative and align external support. Rourke closed the folder. Ms. Voss, I want to be direct with you. Your patient safety report, combined with what we've already built, gives us the internal documentation anchor we've been missing. You are potentially a material witness in a federal case involving pharmaceutical fraud, healthcare record falsification, and federal contract interference. She heard the word potentially and recognized it for what it was. Careful lawyering. She appreciated it. What do you need from me? She said. A formal statement, a signed authorization for us to include your filed report in the investigative record, and, he paused, your cooperation in not discussing the specifics of this conversation with anyone outside this room until we advise otherwise. The last part was where it got complicated. There's a press briefing, she said, outside this building about the Route 9 incident. I'm involved in that. We're aware. I can speak to the incident without speaking to any of this. We'd prefer you not speak at all at this stage. We'd prefer... Wendell Pruitt is in Crestwood Regional right now. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He was readmitted this morning. If what you're describing is what I think it is, he may not be the only current patient whose care is being managed around this system. I filed one report. There may be others in that unit who should be reported. Rourke and Carver exchanged a look that was brief and had an entire conversation inside it. We have a contact at the State Medical Board, Rourke said. A preservation order on patient records was filed approximately, he checked his watch, 50 minutes ago. Nora looked at Whitfield's empty chair. He'd stayed outside the room. His compliance contact had filed faster than she'd expected. That covers existing records, she said. It doesn't cover active care decisions happening right now. We have a medical consultant. You have someone who reads charts. I need to know if there's a clinician reviewing active orders. She leaned forward slightly. Because the same system that falsified Pruitt's documentation is still operating. Adler is still credentialed. He walked into that building this morning, and if his pattern is what you're describing, he walked in knowing that the chart he needed to protect had just been flagged by a nurse who got fired. She paused. What did he do next? Do you know? The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Carver reached into the bag again and set a tablet on the table, turned it so Nora could see the screen. It showed a building access log, the kind generated by keycard entry systems. Crestwood Regional. The timestamp was from this morning, 9:47, more than an hour after Nora had been walked out. Dr. Philip Adler had accessed the pharmacy dispensing room. Not the floor, not his office. The pharmacy. "He went to fix something," Nora said. "We believe so." Rourke's voice was quiet. "We have a warrant for the pharmacy logs. We're executing it now." He looked at her. "Which is why what you've told us about the documentation notation, the format discrepancy, is significant. If he altered records after your report, that's obstruction. That changes the charge profile." Outside the room, in the corridor, there was a noise, movement, more than the ordinary kind, and then Whitfield's voice, not loud but carrying, and another voice she didn't recognize. Rourke looked at the door. Carver stood. The door opened. Whitfield came in, and his face had the quality of someone who had just been handed information in the wrong order and was resequencing rapidly. Behind him was the efficient young medic from the helicopter, and she was holding a phone with both hands, which struck Nora as the specific body language of someone who had just been told something they didn't want to be the person to say. "There's a situation," Whitfield said. Rourke stood. "What kind?" "Harmon Valley just got a call from Crestwood Regional 40 minutes ago. While we were in transit, a patient on the 4th floor experienced a cardiac event." Whitfield looked at Nora, not at Rourke, at Nora. "They're calling it spontaneous, presenting as acute myocardial infarction." She already knew. She felt herself know it before the name came. "Wendell Pruitt," she said. "He's in surgery." Whitfield's jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. "They transferred him to their cardiac unit 2 hours ago. He went into arrest on the table 20 minutes ago." The room went very still. "The surgery team got him back," Whitfield said, "but he's critical. And Nora—" He stopped, restarted. "The surgical notes list the attending who authorized the pre-op medication protocol." She looked at him. "Adler," he said. Rourke moved before anyone else, turning to Carver, saying something in a low, rapid sequence that was clearly operational rather than conversational. Carver had his phone out. Rourke was already heading for the door. Nora sat exactly where she was. She thought about Pruitt's voicemail, the child's voice. You reached Grandpa's phone. She thought about the access log on the tablet. 9:47. The pharmacy. She thought about what Adler had gone there to fix, and whether he'd fixed it, and what the pre-op medication protocol for a cardiac patient looked like when it had been written by a man who needed a complication to look natural. Her hand was shaking again. She put it flat on the table and applied pressure and made it stop. Rourke turned from the doorway. His professional neutrality had acquired an edge. "Ms. Voss, I need to ask you to stay in this building." His voice was clear and serious. "Do not speak to press. Do not speak to anyone from Crestwood Regional. We are escalating." She looked up at him. "What does escalating mean?" she said. "It means this is no longer a procurement fraud investigation." He held her gaze. If Adler modified that protocol knowing Pruitt was readmitted, knowing the chart was flagged, we are potentially looking at willful patient endangerment, possibly more. The word more sat in the room. "Stay here," Rourke said. "Please." He and Carver left. Whitfield stayed. He stood near the door and didn't say anything for a moment, which she appreciated. The medic had gone with the agents. The conference room had the feeling of somewhere that had just held a crisis and was exhaling. "He went into arrest on the table," Nora said. "Yes." "And Adler signed the pre-op protocol." "Yes." She pressed her hand flat on the table again. The cut pulled. She let it. "I need to see that protocol," she said. "You don't have access." "I know." She looked at him. "I need to see it anyway." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. He pulled out his phone. He made a call. He said 3 sentences. He listened. He ended the call. He set the phone on the table and turned it toward her. On the screen was a photograph, taken on someone's personal device, angled slightly, the kind of image that said someone took this quickly and under conditions where they shouldn't have, of a pre-operative medication protocol sheet. Crestwood Regional letterhead, Dr. Philip Adler's signature at the bottom. She read it. She read it again. The ketamine dosage in the anesthesia protocol was double the standard weight-adjusted dose for a cardiac patient with Pruitt's documented history. Not a small deviation, not something explainable by clinical judgment or individual variation. Double. In a man with a known arrhythmia, that dosage in combination with the induction agents listed would predictably, not possibly predictably, exacerbate the exact cardiac event that had just occurred. This wasn't a mistake. She sat with that for exactly 4 seconds. Then her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. Millhaven area code. She looked at it and something in the pattern of the last 12 hours said answer it, so she did. "Is this Nora Voss?" The voice was female, older, slightly breathless. "Yes." "My name is Sandra Pruitt. Wendell is my father." A pause, and Nora could hear in the quality of the pause what it had cost the woman to make this call right now, from wherever she was. "They told me a nurse filed a report about his medication before this happened." Another pause. "They told me her name was Voss." Nora closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "Yes," she said. "He's stable. Right now, he's stable." Sandra's voice was controlled in the way that wouldn't last. "But I just spoke to someone. I don't know who. They called my cell. They said they were from a federal agency, and they couldn't tell me details, but they said I should not authorize any further medication changes to my father's protocol without a second physician review." A pause. "Can you tell me what's happening?" Nora looked at the photograph on Whitfield's phone. The double dosage. Adler's signature. She thought about what Rourke had said. Don't speak to anyone. She thought about Wendell Pruitt going into arrest on a surgical table with a medication protocol written by the man who had the most to lose if Pruitt's chart was ever examined properly. "Ms. Pruitt," she said, "your father's cardiologist. Do you have their name?" "Dr. Ferris. Nolan Ferris. He's not at Crestwood. We chose him specifically because..." "Call Dr. Ferris right now. Tell him your father is post-arrest at Crestwood Regional and you want an independent review of the current medication orders before anything is administered. Use those words exactly. Don't ask. Insist." A silence. "Is my father in danger?" Sandra Pruitt asked, and the question had nothing of legal caution or careful framing in it. It was just a daughter asking. Nora looked at the protocol sheet, at the dosage, at the signature. "Call Dr. Ferris," she said. "Right now." She ended the call. Whitfield was watching her. "If Adler finds out Pruitt's family has been contacted by the FBI," she started. "He already knows." Whitfield's voice was quiet. "My contact confirmed it 20 minutes ago. Someone at Crestwood flagged the warrant execution to administrative leadership the moment agents arrived at the pharmacy." She stood up from the table. "Then he's not going to wait," she said. Whitfield's expression sharpened. "Wait for what?" She picked up his phone and looked at the protocol sheet one more time, looked at the dosage, looked at the secondary medication listed beneath it. An anticoagulant, standard protocol for cardiac surgery. But the brand specified was one she recognized, one that had a documented interaction profile with the elevated ketamine dose that would... "He's already written the next order," she said. The door to the conference room opened. Agent Rourke. His professional neutrality was completely gone. His face was the face of someone who had just received news that had moved faster than his plan. "We have a problem," he said. "Adler's not at Crestwood Regional." Nora went still. "He badged out 40 minutes ago." Rourke looked between her and Whitfield. "His car is in the parking structure. His phone is off." A pause. "And the Crestwood Pharmacy's controlled substance locker was accessed 11 minutes ago with his credentials." "He's not at Crestwood," Nora said slowly. "No." "But someone just accessed the pharmacy with his badge." Rourke's jaw was tight. "Yes. The controlled substance locker. The medication already in Pruitt's IV line. The anticoagulant brand specification in the protocol. The interaction window." "How long does Pruitt have," Nora said, "if the medication in his current protocol isn't reviewed and intercepted?" Rourke didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer it. He was an investigator, not a clinician. She was already moving toward the door. Rourke caught up with her in 3 strides. "Ms. Voss, what's Pruitt's current attending at Crestwood?" She didn't stop walking. "Post-transfer, who took over his care?" "I don't have that..." Then get it. She looked at him sideways, not breaking pace. And get me someone at Crestwood's cardiac unit who can pull his active medication orders right now, not in 10 minutes. Now. Rourke made the call while walking. Carver materialized from somewhere. She hadn't seen him leave and hadn't seen him return. He had that quality. And fell into step on her other side. Whitfield was behind her. The four of them moved through Harmon Valley's corridor with the compressed urgency of people who had stopped being careful about appearances. The main nursing station for Harmon Valley's internal medicine floor was 30 feet ahead. She went straight to it. The nurse behind the desk, mid-40s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the look of someone who had seen a significant amount of nonsense in her career, looked up at the approaching cluster of people with measured calm. "I need a phone to reach Crestwood Regional's cardiac ICU," Nora said. "Direct line, not the main switchboard." The nurse looked at her, at the gauze on her hand, at the dried blood on her scrubbed knee, at Rourke's badge, which he'd produced without being asked. She handed Nora the phone and read a number from a contact sheet without further comment. Nora dialed. It rang 4 times. Someone picked up. "Cardiac ICU, this is Paulson." "My name is Nora Voss. I'm a registered nurse. I filed a patient safety report 3 days ago regarding Wendell Pruitt, currently post-surgical in your unit. I need to speak to whoever holds current attending responsibility for his active orders." A pause. "Are you family?" "I'm the nurse who flagged the medication documentation irregularity that preceded his cardiac event today. There's a federal investigation currently executing a warrant in your pharmacy. I need someone to pull Pruitt's active IV orders right now and hold any administration until the orders are reviewed." Longer pause. Background noise, a monitor, voices, the specific ambient texture of an ICU that was already running at capacity. "Hold on," Paulson said. Nora held. She was aware of Rourke beside her making his own call, lower, and of Whitfield standing slightly back with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who had identified his role in this moment as staying out of it. 40 seconds. "This is Dr. Elaine Vargas. Who am I speaking to?" Nora went through it again, faster this time, with more specificity. The documentation discrepancy, the format deviation, the double ketamine dose in the pre-op protocol, the anticoagulant brand, the interaction profile. She laid it out the way she'd been trained to lay things out when there was no time for context and someone needed to make a decision in the next 30 seconds. Vargas listened without interrupting, which was either a good sign or the sign of someone waiting for her to finish before ending the call. When Nora stopped, there was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. "The anticoagulant is already running," Vargas said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness had acquired weight. "It was started 20 minutes ago." Nora's jaw tightened. "What's his current BP?" "Systolic's been trending down for the last 8 minutes. We thought it was post-surgical normal variance. It's not. He needs the drip stopped and vitamin K antagonist on standby. If his INR is running high, I'm looking at his labs now." A pause. Nora heard the particular sound of someone moving quickly in a clinical space. "INR is 2.9. He's been on anticoagulants for the procedure. We expected elevation, but 2.9 with that interaction profile and a post-arrest cardiovascular status. You need to stop the drip and get hematology on the phone. Now." "Not after you verify with the attending of record." "The attending of record is Adler." "Adler is not in the building." Nora said it flatly. "Contact your chief of medicine. This is a patient safety emergency." Another pause, shorter. "Stopping the drip," Vargas said. Not a question, not a confirmation request. Just the statement of an action being taken by a clinician who had done her own math and arrived at the same answer. "I'm calling Dr. Osei now." "Good." Nora exhaled, slow and controlled. "Please document the time of this call." She handed the phone back to the nurse behind the desk, who took it without expression. Then Nora stood at the station counter and pressed her wrapped hand flat against the surface and breathed for a moment, because she'd been doing everything except that. Rourke ended his own call. He stood beside her with the look of someone who had been moving fast and had just been given a reason to pause. "The pharmacy warrant. Agents found the locker accessed. 1 vial removed. Fentanyl, high concentration." He paused. Adler's badge was used, but the pharmacy's internal camera shows someone in a gray jacket, face down. They're pulling enhanced imaging now. It's not him, Nora said. Rourke looked at her. Explain. Adler is not the kind of man who does his own dirty work at the last minute. He signed the protocol. He made sure the mechanism was in place. If someone used his badge in that pharmacy, he gave the badge to someone, or someone lifted it. She thought about the access log. 9:47, him going in after her report. He went to the pharmacy this morning to check on something. His badge was in an accessed area, someone who has been inside the system with him. A partner, Carver said, or an employee, someone who does the logistics. She looked at Rourke. Who else at Crestwood had access to the pharmacy dispensing records? Administrative level, not clinical? Rourke and Carver exchanged another one of their brief, complete conversations. Raymond Holt has administrative override credentials for the pharmacy system, Carver said, standard for operations directors at facilities his size. Raymond Holt, his careful stillness, the pre-assembled box. Where is Holt right now? Nora asked. Carver was already on his phone. Bad. The answer came back in 6 minutes. Raymond Holt had left Crestwood Regional's administrative offices at 11:42 that morning, citing a personal appointment. He had not returned. His personal vehicle, a dark blue sedan, had been picked up by a traffic camera 2 miles from Harmon Valley Medical Center at 12:58. 12 minutes before Nora had walked in from the overpass. Rourke took that information and went very quiet in the way that wasn't passivity, but calculation. He was rearranging things. Nora could see it in the stillness around his eyes. He followed the helicopters, she said. Or he was already tracking where the critical patients were being taken. Rourke looked at her. Pruitt's transfer was logged in Crestwood's system. Anyone with administrative access could see the destination hospital. He came here to make sure the protocol ran, Nora said. Adler set it up. Holt made sure it happened. We don't have him in the building. You have his car 2 miles away. That's not enough to... Rourke stopped himself. We're pulling the building entry logs now. Whitfield stepped forward. He'd been quiet long enough. I have 8 personnel in this building. I can have eyes on every exit in 4 minutes. Rourke looked at him with the expression of a man who wanted to say, that's not how this works, and had just recognized that this was in fact exactly how this works when the alternative was losing 40 minutes to jurisdictional discussion. Do it, he said. Whitfield was on his radio before the second syllable landed. Nora moved away from the nursing station. She found a section of wall near a window and stood there and let herself think, really think, without talking or reacting to incoming information. The window showed the parking structure from above. Late afternoon, the light going amber and long. Somewhere in this building or near it, a man had come to make sure that a 67-year-old retired machinist with a voicemail greeting recorded by his grandchild did not survive his second day in the hospital well enough to testify to anything. The rage that moved through her was clean and brief. She recognized it, acknowledged it, set it aside. There was no use for it right now. There would be a use for it later, in depositions and hearings and whatever form the accounting would take, but right now it was static. She thought about the pharmacy vial. Fentanyl, high concentration. Removed. Not administered. Or not confirmed as administered. If it had reached Pruitt, the anticoagulant interaction would have masked the respiratory depression. Post-surgical patient, post-arrest, multiple concurrent medications. The presentation would have looked, to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it, like organ systems that had simply failed to recover. But Vargas had stopped the drip. And the INR was documented, and Nora had called, which meant the conversation was time-stamped in Harmon Valley's phone system, which meant there was now a record of a clinical intervention predicated on her specific concerns at a specific time, which made it very difficult for anyone to characterize what had happened to Pruitt today as natural deterioration. She heard footsteps and turned. It was the young medic from the helicopter. Her name tag, Nora had finally registered, said Tran K. She was holding 2 cups of coffee, the bad hospital kind, and she held one out to Nora without preamble. Nora took it. Colonel said you haven't eaten since the protein bar, Tran said. The Colonel is keeping better track of my caloric intake than I am. He keeps track of everything. Tran said it without inflection. Then, after a moment, the kid from the overpass. Marcus. He asked about you. Nora looked at her. His dad asked one of our guys if there was a way to thank the person who pulled him out. We told him you were occupied. Tran paused. He wrote something down, said to give it to the nurse from the highway. She held out a folded piece of paper. Nora took it. She didn't open it immediately. She held it in her ungauged hand and felt the specific weight of it, which was negligible, and told herself she'd read it when she was alone somewhere, because the alternative was doing something in this corridor that she would be functional enough to be embarrassed about later. Thank you, she said. Tran nodded and walked back the way she'd come, which Nora appreciated more than the coffee. The coffee was terrible. She drank it. Raymond Holt was found in the hospital's east stairwell at 4:17 in the afternoon. He was not attempting to leave. That was the thing that struck Nora when Rourke relayed the information, the specific detail that Whitfield's personnel had located him in the stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors, seated on the steps with his jacket folded across his knees, not moving, not on his phone, apparently waiting. For what? He didn't say immediately. He said very little, in fact, until the agents got him to a room and his lawyer was reached by phone, and the lawyer told him, in terms that apparently landed with significant weight, what the charge exposure looked like as of this afternoon. Nora wasn't in the room for that. She was in the corridor outside, which was the closest Rourke would permit, and she heard almost none of it, which was probably appropriate. What she heard was a period of silence, then a voice that even through a closed door had the quality of something collapsing, and then another silence that went on long enough to become something else entirely. Carver came out and spoke quietly to Rourke. Rourke came to Nora. He's talking, Rourke said. She waited. Adler ran the diversion network. Holt managed the administrative cover, procurement records, budget reporting, the documentation framework that made the discrepancies invisible in standard audits. He paused. Holt didn't know about the protocol, about what Adler wrote for Pruitt. He paused again, and this one was heavier. He says he thought Adler was just going to let things quiet down. He didn't know the plan was to make the problem go away, Nora said. Yes. And the fentanyl from the pharmacy? Holt used Adler's badge. He came here to... He says he was going to substitute a portion of Pruitt's IV bag, make the overdose look like a compounding error. Rourke's voice stayed even, with visible effort. He says he got to the unit and the drip was already stopped. Your call to Vargas. He looked at her directly. He turned around and went to the stairwell. She thought about Raymond Holt sitting on the steps with his jacket folded across his knees, and what that image meant. A man who had driven to a hospital to ensure a 67-year-old man died quietly and had found that someone had gotten there first and had simply sat down because he didn't know what else to do. There was something almost pathetic about it, and she didn't let herself feel the almost pathetic because Wendell Pruitt was alive, and that was the only arithmetic that mattered. Where's Adler? She asked. Still looking. Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. His home address? Nothing. Wife says she hasn't heard from him since this morning. We have a BOLO out. He knew the warrant was coming. Yes. Then he's been planning this exit longer than today. She thought about the careful retrospective documentation, the consulting contract that wasn't in his credentialing file, the 2 years of a diversion network operating beneath the surface of a functional hospital ward. He has resources. This isn't a man who improvised. Rourke nodded once. We're working it. It wasn't entirely satisfying. It was, however, honest, and she appreciated honest more than she appreciated reassuring. Pruitt's status, she said, stable. Vargas has him. INR is coming down. They're cautiously optimistic. Rourke paused. His daughter is with him. Nora thought about Sandra Pruitt's voice on the phone. The particular quality of a question asked by someone who already knows the answer is bad, but needs to hear it from another person anyway. Is my father in danger? She pressed the folded piece of paper from Marcus's father between her palm and her thigh, still unread, and looked at the ceiling and breathed. I need to make a statement, she said. For your record, formal, signed, everything you need. We have time to... I want to do it now, while everything is current. She looked at Rourke. And I want a copy. He looked at her for a moment. Of course, he said. Tipped. The statement took 2 hours. She was thorough and specific and did not editorialize, because editorializing was for people who didn't trust the facts to make their own case, and she trusted these facts entirely. She documented the initial observation of the documentation deviation. The meeting with Gail Hutchins. The meeting with Adler, his exact words, his exact posture, the specific quality of the jaw-tightening she'd read as ego at the time and now read as something different. Raymond Holt's language in the termination meeting. The pre-assembled cardboard box. Rourke's colleague, a third agent who'd arrived while Nora was drinking terrible coffee, a woman named Delacroix, with sharp handwriting and the particular patience of someone who had taken a lot of statements from a lot of people under pressure, transcribed and confirmed in real time, cross-referencing with the documentary record they'd already assembled. At several points, Delacroix stopped and asked Nora to repeat something, not because she'd missed it, but because she wanted the wording exact. Nora repeated things exactly. She'd always had that quality, precise recall under pressure, the kind that had occasionally made attending physicians uncomfortable and now was simply what it was, useful. When it was done and signed, Rourke set the folder on the table and looked at her with the expression of someone acknowledging a job that had been done well without wanting to be effusive about it. One more thing, Nora said. He waited. The audit, the one that was closed 14 months ago, the compliance contractor who tabled it after a call from Crestwood's board. She held his gaze. That person needs to be in this. They're already being interviewed. I want to make sure, because that closure is the reason this ran for another 14 months. That's the reason Pruitt's chart looked the way it looked. If the audit had been pursued... I understand, Rourke said, quietly, without defense. We understand. She nodded. She looked at the table, at her signed statement in its folder, at the gauze on her hand, grayed at the edges now, needing to be changed, which she hadn't gotten around to because there had been approximately no pause in which to do it. Is there somewhere I can clean this up? She said, nodding at her hand. Delacroix, without looking up from her notes, pointed at the door. Supply closet, 2 doors down. Basic wound care kit on the second shelf. The supply closet was narrow and smelled like disinfectant, and was exactly the right size for one person to be alone for a few minutes. Nora redressed her hand with practiced efficiency, pulling the tape with her teeth, cutting the gauze with the small scissors from the kit, the way she'd done 100 times for other people, and occasionally, usually in conditions with worse lighting than this, for herself. She opened the folded piece of paper. The handwriting was large and slightly uneven. A man who didn't write much or who had written this quickly. It said, "My son is breathing because of you. I don't have the right words. Daniel Okafor." She folded it back up. She held it in her clean-dressed hand for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket, next to the challenge coin, and went back out. The press situation had not resolved itself in her absence. It had, in the way of press situations, become more complicated. 2 of the 3 news outlets that had been at the hospital perimeter had obtained enough bystander footage from the Route 9 incident to run preliminary reports. Nora knew this because Whitfield told her, and Whitfield knew because his communications officer, apparently one of the 8 personnel he'd stationed around the building, had been monitoring it. The reports were, so far, accurate about the incident and vague about the woman at the center of it, identifying her only as a bystander with medical training. One outlet had matched the helicopter footage to the 4th Medical Brigade's insignia and reached out to the brigade's public affairs office, which had responded with a brief statement about the team's involvement that said nothing about Nora. The 4th outlet, a regional investigative news operation called the Millhaven Ledger, was running a different story. Whitfield showed her the notification on his phone. The headline read, "Crestwood Regional Nurse Fired Hours Before Highway Rescue. Source says termination followed patient safety report." The article was 40 minutes old. It had a named source, Paulson, the ICU nurse at Crestwood she'd spoken to on the phone, who had apparently spoken to someone else, who had apparently spoken to a reporter. The article was careful, and the reporter had done the basic work of contacting Crestwood's communications office, which had responded with no comment. How did they get this fast? Nora said. They've been watching Crestwood, Whitfield said. The ledger has been looking at the hospital for 7 months. There's a reporter, guy named Osei Mensah, who's been filing FOIA requests on their procurement records for most of this year. He paused. He was at the overpass this afternoon. He's the one who ID'd you. She stood with that for a moment. The FBI investigation, she said. Does Rourke know about the ledger story? He does now. Whitfield's voice was dry. He's not happy about the timing, but there's nothing in the article that compromises the warrant, and Holt is already talking, so the operational sensitivity is... He tilted his head. Reduced. And Adler's still missing. Yes, he paused, which may become less of a problem than Rourke thinks. She looked at him. Why? Because a man running from a federal warrant, on a day when his co-conspirator has been arrested and is talking, doesn't have a lot of good options. He either has resources we don't know about, which is possible, Chicks, or he went somewhere instinctive, somewhere he knows. Whitfield looked at her steadily. The investigators are working it, but there's a reason why people who've spent years operating inside institutional systems don't run well when those systems collapse. They're not built for exposure. They're built for the inside. It was a precise and accurate read. She recognized it as such. Where does that leave me? She said. Not helplessly, just as a genuine logistical question, the kind she asked about everything. Whitfield considered it. Rourke is going to want you available for the next 72 hours. The state medical board has your patient safety report flagged for expedited review based on the federal case intersection. You'll get a formal communication about that tomorrow. Crestwood's administration is going to be managing a very bad news cycle starting tonight, which means your termination is going to be examined publicly whether you want it to be or not. He paused. And the Ledger reporter wants to talk to you. I gathered. You don't have to. I know. She looked out a window at the parking structure. The light had gone fully amber and was heading toward gold. Somewhere in the city, Adler was in a car or in a room or somewhere in the gap between what he'd planned and what had actually happened. And she thought briefly about what that felt like from the inside. The moment when you'd built something so carefully over so long that you'd stopped being able to imagine it unraveling. And then it had. And the ground you'd been standing on had turned out to be the ceiling of something else entirely. She hoped it was uncomfortable. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different area code from Sandra Pruitt. She answered. Ms. Voss? A man's voice, formal and measured. My name is Jeffrey Osei Mensah. I'm an investigative reporter with the Millhaven Ledger. I apologize for the direct contact. I got your number from... I know who you are, she said, and I know where you got my number. She paused. What do you know? A beat of silence that told her he'd expected deflection and was recalibrating. I know you filed a patient safety report 3 days ago that was preceded by a medication documentation irregularity. I know you were terminated the same week. I know you organized a mass casualty scene this afternoon with military-grade efficiency, and I know that federal agents executed a search warrant at Crestwood Regional's pharmacy approximately 3 hours ago. What are you asking me? I'm asking if you'll go on record. He paused. Not about the investigation, not about anything the FBI needs protected, about what happened to you, before all of this. She thought about Raymond Holt sitting on the stairs with his jacket on his knees, about the carefully prepared box, about Wendell Pruitt's voicemail and his daughter's voice, and the INR number that had been at 2.9 when it should have been watched more carefully, and would have been, if someone hadn't spent months making sure the right people weren't looking. Not tonight, she said. A brief pause. When? When the investigation advises me I can. You'll know when I can because Rourke will stop actively avoiding your calls. Another beat. Then, fair enough. He didn't push, which told her something about him. One question off the record. Ask. The challenge coin, the one that came out of your pocket at Crestwood when they walked you out. He paused. The bystander footage caught it. The eagle face up on the floor. I looked up the design. He paused again, carefully. 209th Medical Battalion, forward surgical. She said nothing. The advanced trauma protocols used by 3 Army units currently deployed in 2 theaters, Osei Mensah said, carry a designation that traces back to a senior medical instructor who separated from service 4 years ago. He paused. There's no name attached to the original protocols. The Army removed it, but I've been trying to find it for 3 months. Another pause. Is that you? She looked at the challenge coin silhouette in her pocket, the worn smooth edge she could feel through the fabric. Off the record, she said. Off the record, he confirmed. Yes, she said. A long silence. I need you to know, Ose Mensah said quietly, that I've spoken to 2 men who served in units that trained on those protocols. One of them told me the instructor who wrote the initial framework was the reason he came home. He stopped. I wanted you to know that someone was trying to find your name before any of this happened. The corridor was quiet around her. The afternoon light through the window had turned the floor tiles a color that wasn't quite gold and wasn't quite amber and didn't have a name she knew. She held the phone and breathed. When Rourke clears me, she said, I'll call you first. She ended the call. Whitfield was waiting in the corridor when she came back. He had the look of a man who had received news and was deciding how to deliver it. They found Adler, he said. She straightened. Where? Attempting to board a private charter flight from Delwood Regional Airport, 40 miles east of here. He paused. He had a bag, a laptop, documentation. They have him? They have him. Whitfield's expression wasn't triumphant. It was the specific look of a person who had seen enough situations like this to know that the arrest was not the end of it, but was a particular kind of beginning. He's been read his rights. His attorney has been contacted. He held her gaze. And there's something in the bag. What? Documentation he was apparently planning to use. Financial records, email threads, the kind of thing you bring when you're planning to negotiate. His jaw tightened. The email threads include a chain between Adler and Holt from this morning, before the warrant. He stopped. There's a message from Holt that says, and I'm quoting Rourke here, Voss filed with the state. She knows about the chart. We need Pruitt resolved today. The words resolved today settled into her the way cold water settles, completely and immediately, displacing everything else for a moment. She'd known. She'd constructed the picture from available evidence and known. But hearing it in those words, that specific clinical euphemism for what they had intended for a 67-year-old man in a hospital bed, made it land differently, made it real in a way that the deductive version of it hadn't quite been. Rourke has the email chain, she said. In evidence. Yes. And Adler brought it because he was going to use it against Holt. That's the working theory. Whitfield looked at her steadily. He was going to offer Holt as the primary in exchange for reduced exposure. 2 men who were going to let someone die, now each trying to let the other take the weight. Yes. She looked at the floor, then up. What happens to the hospital, she said. To the staff, the nurses, the people who had nothing to do with this? Whitfield's expression shifted. It was the question he hadn't been expecting and the one that told him something about her. The investigation will target the individuals. The hospital's operating license will undergo a review by the state medical board. Leadership will be removed. He paused. The staff who weren't involved should be okay. That's not always how it goes, but the federal interest here is in the individuals, not the institution. And Gail Hutchins. She failed to act on your report. Whether that constitutes culpability or negligence or just bad judgment is going to be a question for the board review. He paused. My read? She was scared, not corrupt. But scared isn't a defense when patient safety is the thing you didn't protect. No, Nora said. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. I need to call Mac, she said. Whitfield blinked. Who's my cat? He needs to be fed. She looked at the time. He's going to be very unhappy. He has opinions about the 4 o'clock feeding window, and we are significantly past it. She paused. I need to call my neighbor, Dale. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, and then his expression did something she hadn't seen from him all day. Something that was actually, quietly, a smile. We can have someone. Dale will do it. He's passive-aggressive about recycling bins, but he's good with Mac. She pulled out her phone. Give me 5 minutes. She called Dale. He picked up on the second ring and didn't ask where she was or why she sounded the way she sounded. He said, "The one-eyed one?" And she said yes, and he said, "I'll feed him." And that was the entire conversation, which was why Dale, despite the recycling bin notes, was the neighbor she'd been glad to have. She put her phone away. Whitfield was waiting, patient as ever. "Rourke wants to debrief tomorrow morning," she said. "State medical board contact will be in touch. Ose Mensa is waiting for clearance." She ticked through it methodically. "Is there anything else tonight?" "One thing." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Plain government issue with his name and contact information and a secondary number she didn't recognize. "The secondary number is a direct line to my brigade's medical operations office. What you did on that overpass today, and what you did in this building this afternoon, those are not unrelated to things my unit is trying to build." He held the card toward her. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm asking you to think about it." She took the card. She looked at it briefly. She put it in the same pocket as the challenge coin and the folded note from Daniel Okafor. "I should tell you something," she said. He waited. "I'm not easy to work with. I'm direct in ways that create friction. I notice things that people would rather not have noticed, and I say them out loud. I don't do well in structures where the institutional hierarchy matters more than what's true." She paused. "I've been told this more than once." Whitfield regarded her with the expression of a man looking at a description of a person who is exactly who he came here to find. "I spent 22 years in the United States Army," he said. "I have no idea what you're warning me about." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. She walked toward the hospital exit. The automatic doors slid open and the evening air came in, cooler than the afternoon had been, with the particular quality of an autumn evening in a city that was continuing to operate regardless of what had happened inside one of its buildings today. Traffic sounds. Somewhere, a food cart operator closing up. A bus going past on the street beyond the parking structure. Her phone buzzed. The screen showed a news notification from the Millhaven Ledger. New article, posted 4 minutes ago. She clicked it. The headline read, "Former Army Combat Medic Instructor. Terminated by Crestwood Regional hours before saving lives. Named in federal investigation as witness against hospital officials." Below the headline was a photograph. It was from the overpass. Bystander footage stilled into a frame. She could see the back of her own head, and in front of her the van doors she'd wrenched open, and just at the edge of the frame, the boots of a 14-year-old boy being pulled clear of a fire that would close off the vehicle completely 40 seconds later. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and kept walking. Behind her, in a hospital somewhere on the other side of the city, Wendell Pruitt's INR was coming down, and his daughter was sitting in the chair next to his bed. And Raymond Holt was in a room with a federal agent and a criminal attorney working through the mathematics of what he had agreed to do and what that agreement was going to cost him. And Dr. Philip Adler was in federal custody at an airport 40 miles east of here, with a bag full of documentation he had planned to use as leverage, which had instead become the most complete record anyone could have assembled of exactly what he'd done and exactly how long he'd done it. The evening air was cold enough that she could see her breath. She stood outside the hospital entrance and looked at the sky and thought about the day she'd had. The badge on the floor, the coin spinning, Doyle's apologetic non-gaze, the box she'd set on a bus stop bench that was probably still there, and she thought about the call she'd make tomorrow, and the statement she'd expand, and the Millhaven Ledger reporter she'd speak to when Rourke cleared her. And she thought about the card in her pocket, the secondary number, the thing she hadn't said yes to yet, but also hadn't said no to. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized. Harmon Valley Medical Center. She answered. "Ms. Voss." Dr. Elaine Vargas. Her voice had changed since the last call. Not dramatically, but the weight had lifted by a specific increment. "I wanted to let you know. Pruitt's numbers are stable. We're doing well. He's awake." A pause. He asked if the nurse who called this afternoon could be thanked. Nora stood on the sidewalk outside Harmon Valley Medical Center in the cold autumn evening, with the bronze edge of a challenge coin in her pocket and a note from a stranger, and a card that might be the shape of what came next. "Tell him the nurse says he's not allowed to scare his daughter like that again," she said. Vargas was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll tell him exactly that." The call ended. She put the phone away. The evening continued around her, city-sized and indifferent and completely unchanged, the way evenings are after the kind of days that change everything else. And somewhere in the Crestwood Regional Administrative Offices, a network that had operated for years inside the structure of a trusted institution was being examined file by file, record by record, in a process that was just beginning and would not stop until every thread had been pulled. And two of the men at the center of it were sitting in separate rooms, each trying to decide how much of the other they were willing to give up, not yet understanding that between the documents in Adler's bag and the emails Holt's phone had already surrendered, they had already given up everything. 3 weeks after the evening, she stood outside Harmon Valley Medical Center, watching her own breath in the cold air. Nora Voss sat in a state medical board hearing room on the 7th floor of a government building in downtown Millhaven, and answered questions for 4 hours without once losing her thread. The room was beige and fluorescent and smelled faintly of the previous occupant's coffee, and the 3-member panel across from her asked their questions in the careful procedural language of people who dealt in institutional consequences, which meant they were asking about documentation and timing and chain of notification. They were not asking about what it felt like to be walked out of a building where she'd spent 3 years. They were not asking about Wendell Pruitt's voicemail. They were not asking about a challenge coin spinning on a tile floor. Those things were not relevant to their process, which was fine, because Nora had never needed anyone to ask about the things that mattered. She'd learned a long time ago that what you carried regardless of whether anyone acknowledged the weight. She answered everything they asked. She answered it accurately and completely and without embellishment, because the facts laid in sequence were sufficiently damning that embellishment would have only muddied them. When they were done, the panel chair, a woman named Dr. Albright, silver-haired and precise, who had not softened or hardened her expression across 4 hours, looked at Nora over the rim of her reading glasses and said, "Your patient safety report demonstrated correct clinical judgment and appropriate escalation under the circumstances. The board finds no professional deficiency in your conduct." It wasn't an apology. The board didn't issue apologies. But it was a finding, official and entered into the record, that what she had done was right. That she had been right. That the institution had failed and she had not. Nora said, "Thank you," because it was the appropriate response, and because she genuinely meant it, and because the alternative was saying something more complicated about what it cost to be right about a thing that you'd been punished for, and this was not the place for that. She took the elevator down alone and walked out into a Millhaven afternoon that had gone from cool to cold in the 3 weeks since the overpass, winter making its intentions clear a month early, the way it sometimes did in this part of the state. She stood on the sidewalk with her coat open because she hadn't gotten around to buttoning it and called Whitfield. He picked up on the second ring. "Board finding," she said. "No professional deficiency." "Good." His voice carried the particular efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this specific call and had already known what he was going to say next. "When can you be in Northbridge?" She thought about her apartment, about Mac, who had adjusted to the disruption of the past 3 weeks with the indifference of a creature who measured the quality of life primarily in terms of meal timing and lap availability. About the cardboard box that was still in her car, because she hadn't unpacked it, not because she was sentimental about it, but because she hadn't decided yet what to do with the objects inside. The stethoscope, the laminated drug reference card, the photograph of mountains. 2 weeks, she said. "I'll have the paperwork ready in 1, he said, which was Whitfield's version of negotiating. 2 weeks, she said again. A brief pause. "Fine." She could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to both. "The program director position is yours pending final clearance, which given today's findings should be a formality. Civilian-military integrated emergency response. You'll be building the curriculum from the ground floor." "I know," she said. "You've told me 4 times. I want to make sure you understand the scope." "I understand the scope." She looked down the street at the city doing what cities do, cycling through its ordinary afternoon. "I also want clinical hours built into the contract. I'm not doing this from a desk. That's already in the draft. Then we're good. She ended the call and buttoned her coat. Now, the Millhaven Ledger story ran the following Tuesday, and it ran long. Jeffrey Osai Mensah had done what good investigative reporters do. He had found the connective tissue between things that looked unrelated and laid it out in sequence so that a reader could follow it from the first loose thread to the full unraveling. He'd traced the procurement discrepancy back 26 months. He'd documented the consulting contract between Adler and Holloway Medical Supply, including the specific correlation between Adler's prescription volume and Holloway's quarterly billing peaks. He'd found 2 other patients whose charts showed the same documentation anomaly Nora had identified in Pruitt's record, one of whom had been discharged without incident, one of whom had died 8 months ago of what had been classified as post-surgical cardiac failure, a death whose case was now being reviewed by the State Attorney General's office. He'd also documented in precise and unremarkable language the sequence of Nora's termination, the filed report, the 48-hour window, the calls from Holt's office phone to the contracting oversight board, the pre-assembled box. He had not been dramatic about it. He had simply been accurate, which was worse for everyone involved than drama would have been, because drama could be dismissed and accuracy couldn't. The story ran with 2 photographs. The first was the overpass frame, her back, the van doors, Marcus's boots at the edge of the fire. The second was a photograph she hadn't known anyone had taken. Her standing in Harmon Valley's parking structure in the amber evening light, phone to her ear, coat open, looking at something above the frame. She looked tired in the photograph. She looked like someone who had been awake for too long and was working anyway. She looked, she thought when she finally saw it, exactly like herself. The story was shared 17,000 times in the first 48 hours. Nora did not track this. Tran K, who had apparently developed a habit of monitoring things on Nora's behalf, texted her the number, to which Nora responded with a thumbs-up emoji, which was the entirety of her engagement with the number 17,000. What she did engage with was the call she received on Thursday afternoon from a woman named Carla Diaz, who identified herself as the daughter of the man named Jerome Diaz, who had died 8 months ago of post-surgical cardiac failure at Crestwood Regional. Carla Diaz was 43 years old and had been told by 2 separate hospital administrators in the months after her father's death that his outcome was consistent with his underlying condition and that there was no cause for further inquiry. She had believed them because she'd had no reason not to, and because grief doesn't leave you with the bandwidth to interrogate institutions. She called Nora because she'd read the Ledger story, and she needed to ask someone directly. Was it possible that what happened to her father was part of this? Nora sat at her kitchen table with Mac redistributing his weight across her feet and told Carla Diaz the honest answer, which was that she didn't know, and that the State Attorney General's review would determine that, and that Carla should engage an attorney who could formally request that her father's records be included in the review. I just need to know if someone did something wrong, Carla said. I know, Nora said, because if someone did, if this is why... She stopped. The review will answer that. Nora paused. What I can tell you is that your instinct to ask is correct. Whatever the answer turns out to be, you're right to ask. Carla Diaz was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, she said. After she hung up, Nora sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. Max stepped onto her lap with the confidence of a creature who had never in his life doubted his welcome, and she put her hand on his back and sat there in the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful exactly, but is necessary, the kind that follows something that doesn't have a clean resolution because the loss at the center of it is real, and the review, whatever it found, would not bring Jerome Diaz back to his daughter. That was the part that didn't get fixed. That was always the part that didn't get fixed. She had learned that in the field, and she'd learned it again here. Justice was real, and it mattered, and it was not the same thing as repair, and the gap between those two things was where people like Carla Diaz lived indefinitely. And the most honest thing you could do was acknowledge the gap instead of pretending it wasn't there. Well, Dr. Philip Adler pleaded not guilty at his arraignment and retained a defense attorney whose primary public statement consisted of the phrase, significant prosecutorial overreach, which the Ledger reported, and which Rourke, when Nora asked him about it in their final formal debrief, described as the standard first position of someone whose documentation was found in their own bag. The charges included healthcare fraud, federal contract interference, pharmaceutical diversion, and, after the state attorney general formally joined the investigation following Jerome Diaz's case review, one count of criminal negligence in connection with a patient death. The negligence charge carried the most weight and the most uncertainty. Proving it required establishing that the deviation from standard care had been deliberate rather than negligent in the ordinary sense, and that the outcome had been foreseeable. Rourke said the evidence was strong. He also said these things took time, and that she should prepare for a process that moved at the pace of federal proceedings, which was a diplomatic way of saying slowly and at great cost to everyone's patience. Raymond Holt accepted a plea agreement. The terms included full cooperation, a federal fraud conviction, forfeiture of his pension, and a ban from any future role in healthcare administration. He received 4 years. His attorney called it a proportionate resolution. Nora read the sentencing notice and thought about the phrase "resolved today" in the email chain and said nothing to anyone about what she thought the proportionality was. Gail Hutchins received a formal censure from the state nursing board and a mandatory remediation program. She was not terminated. She was not exonerated. She was required, for the first time in her professional life, to sit in a room and have her failure to act examined in specific detail by people who held formal authority over her license. Nora had no particular feeling about this outcome. It was what the process had determined, and the process had done what it could with what was in front of it. Crestwood Regional's executive leadership was removed in its entirety within 6 weeks of the federal warrant. The hospital's operating license was placed under conditional status pending a governance review, which meant external oversight and mandatory reporting requirements for 18 months. The fourth-floor nursing staff, the ones who had worked around Adler's decisions and filed their own notes and done their jobs in an environment that had not given them the support or the information they needed, kept working. Nora thought about them sometimes. She hoped they were okay. She didn't know most of their names. On a Friday morning in late November, 8 days before she drove to Northbridge to begin the process of building a curriculum from nothing, Nora went to Harmon Valley Medical Center. She wasn't summoned. She wasn't expected. She had a reason, but the reason was not institutional. Wendell Pruitt was being discharged. She knew this because Sandra Pruitt had called her the previous week, not about the investigation, not about the review, just to say that her father was being discharged Friday morning, and that he had asked, in the specific way of people who don't usually ask for things, whether it would be possible for the nurse who had called that afternoon to come by. Sandra had said she completely understood if that wasn't possible or appropriate, that she wasn't trying to create an obligation. She'd said it in the careful way of someone who had been in enough complicated situations to know that other people's time and energy had limits. Nora had said she'd be there. She found them in the discharge waiting area on the ground floor, Pruitt in a wheelchair that he was clearly tolerating rather than accepting, a compact man in his late 60s with the look of someone who had spent decades working with his hands and found horizontal rest philosophically disagreeable. He was wearing a plaid shirt his daughter had brought from home. Sandra stood beside him, one hand on the wheelchair handle, looking the way adult children look when a parent has frightened them badly enough that the fear doesn't entirely leave, even after the danger has. Pruitt looked up when she came in. She'd expected something, formality, or the specific discomfort of meeting a stranger who had been involved in the worst week of your life. Instead, he looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had decided exactly how he felt about a thing and wasn't going to perform otherwise. "You're the one who called," he said. "Yes." "Sandra told me what you said, about not letting her scare me like that." He paused. "She tells me that a lot." Sandra made a sound that was partway between a laugh and something less stable. Nora looked at Pruitt. "I filed the report because the chart was wrong. That's the job." "I know that's the job," he said. "I also know that a lot of people do the job differently than you did." He held her gaze without drama. "You got fired for it." "Yes." "And then you went and did what you did on that highway." He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the particular way of someone who has encountered something they respect and doesn't have an adequately sized container for it. "I read the article, the whole thing. It was accurate," she said. "I know it was." He straightened in the wheelchair. I'm sorry you lost your job over what you did for me. I want to say that plainly. She looked at him. Don't be, she said. What came after is worth what came before. It wasn't a performance. She meant it in the plain, functional way she meant most things. The job she'd lost had been at an institution that had used her and then tried to neutralize her. What came after? Rourke's recorder on the table, Vargas stopping the drip, the board finding, Whitfield's card in her pocket, the 2 weeks until Northbridge, was not a consolation prize. It was the actual thing. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his plaid shirt, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone whose sternum was still mending, and took out a folded piece of paper. My granddaughter drew this, he said. She's 7. I asked her to. He held it toward Nora. Sandra told her there was a nurse who helped Grandpa. She wanted to draw her. Nora took the paper and opened it. It was a crayon drawing in the specific style of 7-year-old art. Bold lines, bright colors, a figure in blue with yellow hair, and what appeared to be a stethoscope the size of a hula hoop. The figure was surrounded by smaller figures, some standing, some prone, and there were helicopters overhead in a shade of red that didn't exist in nature but communicated helicopter clearly. At the bottom, in careful block letters that were slightly uneven and deeply earnest, it said, The Nurse Who Saves. Nora looked at it for a long time. She didn't say anything because she couldn't say anything without her voice doing something she'd regret, and she had too much dignity for that in a hospital discharge waiting area. So she looked at the drawing until she had her face in order, and then she looked up. Thank her for me, she said. She's outside in the car, Sandra said. She wanted to come in, but she was worried about what hospitals look like inside. She paused. She's 7. Nora looked toward the automatic doors at the front of the building. Through the glass, in the parking lot, there was a car, and in the back seat of the car, a small face was pressed to the window, looking in with the unself-conscious intensity of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Nora folded the drawing carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she walked to the automatic doors and went outside. The child's face disappeared from the window when she got close to the car, then reappeared slightly lower, a tactical retreat followed by renewed reconnaissance. Nora crouched to window level. The child looked at her. 7 years old, Pruitt's dark eyes, a coat with a hood that had animal ears. Nora knocked on the glass. The child looked at her. Then, with tremendous seriousness, knocked back. Nora held up the coat pocket where she'd put the drawing, tapping it twice. The child's face broke into a smile that had no calculation in it whatsoever, the kind of smile that existed before people learned to manage their reactions, and she pressed her palm flat against the window glass. Nora pressed hers against the other side. Then she stood up and went back inside and helped Sandra Pruitt navigate the discharge paperwork, because there were 3 forms that the desk staff had sorted incorrectly, and she caught it without thinking, and the desk nurse looked at her sideways and said, Are you medical? And Nora said yes, without the hesitation she'd had in the 3 weeks since Crestwood, because the board finding had returned that word to her, not given it back exactly, because it had always been hers, but confirmed what she'd known and what they'd tried to make her doubt. She was medical. She was exactly what she'd always been. She drove to Northbridge on a Tuesday because Whitfield had asked for Monday, and she'd said Tuesday out of principle, which was petty, and she accepted that about herself. The drive was 3 hours through winter farmland, the kind of flat geography that let you see weather systems coming from 40 miles away. And she had the radio off and the heater on and the cardboard box in the back seat still packed. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, she reached back without looking and took the stethoscope out of the box and put it on the passenger seat, and then took out the laminated drug reference card and put it on top of the stethoscope. And that was enough for now. The photograph of the mountains could wait. She'd know where to put it when she saw the office. She thought about the things she was carrying into this next iteration of her life. A board finding, a federal case in process, a crayon drawing in her coat pocket, a note from Daniel Okafor, a card with a secondary number she'd already called enough times that she no longer had to look at it to dial. She thought about Jerome Diaz and his daughter Carla, and the review that was still running, and the fact that some accounting was complete and some was still in process, and some would never be as complete as the people who needed it most deserved. That was the truth. And she was going to carry it because not carrying it would have required pretending it wasn't there. She thought about what it meant to be the person in the room who noticed, who wrote the report, who made the call, who stayed in it when staying in it was costly. There was nothing heroic about it in the way heroic got described. It wasn't clean, it wasn't without personal damage, it hadn't felt like strength while it was happening. It had felt like obligation, which was a less glamorous word and a more accurate one. You didn't do those things because you were exceptional. You did them because you were the person who saw the thing, and the alternative was looking away. And looking away was something she had decided, years ago and again since then, that she wasn't built for. That decision had cost her things. She was honest about that. It had cost her a job she'd needed and a sense of institutional safety she'd maybe never had, but had wanted, and the particular comfort of operating inside a structure without constantly auditing its walls. It would probably cost her things in the future. Institutions did not uniformly reward people who noticed problems, and she was not going to pretend that one good outcome had changed the underlying structure of how power operated. But it had saved Wendell Pruitt, and it had put Raymond Holt in a room explaining himself to federal agents, and it had started a review that might tell Carla Diaz what happened to her father. And it had pulled a 14-year-old boy out of a burning vehicle on a highway overpass, which had nothing to do with Crestwood Regional and everything to do with who she was when the situation required it, which turned out to be the same person regardless of whether she had a badge or a box. The Northbridge city limit sign came up on her right. Population 42,000. An unremarkable sign for a city she'd never been to, the kind of sign that didn't know it was marking the beginning of anything in particular. She drove past it. The office Whitfield had arranged for her was in a building adjacent to the National Guard facility on the south side of the city, a practical space with large windows and enough square footage to run training scenarios if you moved the furniture, which she was already planning to do. He'd left her a key and a badge and a binder of existing curriculum frameworks from 3 different programs with a sticky note on the cover that said, "Starting point only in handwriting that was surprisingly illegible for someone so precise in everything else." She parked. She sat in the car for a moment. She took the challenge coin out of her pocket and turned it over in her palm. The eagle face up, the worn smooth edge that her thumb knew from years of carrying it. She'd been given it at the end of her second deployment by a senior officer who had said almost nothing while handing it to her, because the people who understood what it meant never needed to explain it. She put it back in her pocket. She got out of the car. She took the stethoscope and the laminated card from the passenger seat. She stood in the parking lot of a building in a city she didn't know yet, at the beginning of work that hadn't been built yet, with a cut on her right hand that had mostly healed and left a small scar at the base of her palm that she'd have for the rest of her life. She went inside. She was exactly who she had always been. And this time, there was no one left to tell her that wasn't enough.